So I'm going to be sharing some reflections about existential reflections in the poetry of a really famous and I think very sort of beautiful in terms of his writing poet in Israel. His name is Natan. And what really made me decide to do this is I've taught his poetry a number of times at Mayanot, and I found some of his poems to be simply haunting. And I felt that preparing for this day of study would give me the opportunity to kind of explore what it is about that from a literary analysis, a little bit of philosophical analysis, and what he was trying to accomplish. I would say still is. He's 83 years old, alive in Israel today, but I believe blind and not, and that would not necessarily prevent him from producing, but he is not producing poetry at the moment. But certainly, is still an important figure. Okay, so the first thing that I'd like to do, and as is mentioned in the program, so that there'll be the prospect of everyone understanding what's going on, I'll conduct this in English, but the texts are all going to be in Hebrew. So I'm going to assume a certain amount or a lot of understanding of reading of written Hebrew. Okay, the first thing I'd like to do is talk a little bit about a tiny bit of his biography, although the expanded version I think is really interesting. We can talk about that later if we have time. And also what his style is, and really intentional style, not just what we've noticed about it, but what he proposes as what poetry should be. So first of all, Natan was born in 1930, that's fine, in 1930 in Germany. I think I'll put sources here if anyone wants, they can just take them. Natan was born in 1930 in Germany, and he arrived in Israel in 1936 as a refugee from Nazi Germany. He actually arrived, his family came when he was born. His father was a German Jew. His family came when they were warned by someone in the know that his father was going to be targeted very soon by the Nazis. So they left, they ran away from Germany, ended up first in Paris and then in Haifa. And Haifa is really where he spent his professional and literary career. He was very much associated with the University of Haifa. He entered Tzahal in 1948, and by 1955, when he was 25 years old, he had written his first book of poetry. And he was really prolific. He proceeded to write a number more books of poetry, compendia, throughout the 1950s and the 1960s, possibly even, as late as the 1970s. Sort of a few poems here and there. So he's really considered a very important poet in Israel. The question is why. So when we think about Israeli poetry of the 1940s and the 1950s, the themes that will often come to mind are patriotic. And it's really about the collective we. What we do for the country, what the country does for us in some cases. There's a lot of military theme, of course, wars, independence, the exhilaration, the sadness, the pain, the emotion that comes along with everything that has to do with the establishment of the state and the struggles thereafter. For him, or in him, poetry, his poetry was really a break from the primarily pre-1948 ideological poetry, but even some from the post-1948 ideological poetry, and from the patriotic poetry of Israel that were focused on the collective. He was not interested in that. He didn't think that that's what poetry, he doesn't think, I should say, that that's poetry, what poetry is for. That is not the purpose of poetry. So what he did is he sort of switched the focus on the I, to the I, rather than the we. He said, abandon the collective. The poetry is about me and myself, my experiences, who I am. It was decidedly non-ideological. And again, not just because he didn't care to write about ideology, he did not think poetry should be ideological. Rather, he felt it should be a reflection of human experience. His tone tends to be understated, sometimes even restrained. I'll share with you some 6 or 7 line poems that say, convey a world within them, but very much in restrained tones. And there is really very little poetic pathos, at least on the surface, in what he presents. It also is free of, it really is free verse. You'll see very rarely will you see rhyme or meter in Natan's poetry, and kind of he broke away from that, which was very much a part of, if you're familiar with poetry, that is all the things that this is not. If you think of Natan Alterman and Yehuda Amichai, Magash HaKesef, Elanu Chayalim Almonim, the poems that were very much everything that this isn't, he broke away from that. For Natan Zach, the goal of poetry, and I should point out that Natan Zach is as well known in Israel as a poetry critic, meaning a professional poetry critic, but also literally a criticizer of other poets, as well known as a critic as a poet himself. So he states emphatically in critiquing, for example, Natan Alterman, that the goal of poetry is to allow the reader entry into the poet's personal experience. And it's not to move the reader. It's not to inspire the reader to anger or to happiness, not to provoke, not to prophesy. So there's no predictions about the future. He doesn't consider himself a soothsayer. He is a conveyor of human experience. That's what he wants to be, and that is what he is in these poems. He also believed that the poet is the everyman. That his experiences, both Natan Zach's and ideally every poet's experiences and reflections, are not any more authentic or significant or authoritative than those of his readers. So you and I, the poet would say in his framework, you and I live life equally. Each of us goes through experiences day to day, minute to minute, year to year, and your set of experiences are as significant and worthy of conveying to me, if you choose to do so, as mine are as the poet. And that's where he comes from, and you'll see just in a minute where that how that looks. But first, I just want to show you a quick poem that is not in your source sheet that I think reflects this approach. So I'm actually just going to read it through quickly. And what the title here is Hatzayav Metzayer. So that means that the painter or the drawer draws. Hatzayav Metzayer, Hasofer Mesaper, Hapasal Mefasel, Ach HaMeshorer Eino Shar. הוא הר בצידי הדרך, או עץ, או ריח, משהו בורח, או כבר לא מה שהיה, ולא יחזור, כמו עונות השנה, החום, הקור, הקרח והצחוק של הלב כאשר הוא אוהב, או מים, משהו רחב, בלתי מובן, כמו רוח או אונייה או שיר, משהו שמשאיר משהו. So there actually is a little bit of rhyme here. This is unusual for him. But the essential point of this poem, is that whereas if you name a person by his profession, he does what his profession indicates, right? The sculptor builds sculptures, the painter paints, the author authors books. But what the poet does is he is not himself. He does not. I'll say what he does do, not what he doesn't do. So his conclusion here is that he's something that leaves something behind. He simply leaves you with something. So what he's essentially saying here is he doesn't have the kind of authority. By his own nature, he doesn't have the kind of authority as these other kinds of artists. He leaves something behind for you to experience in the way, hopefully, that he experienced it himself. With that in mind, let's actually look at some of the poetry. So, I'm sorry, I forgot to mention one thing. The whole title of this is about existential reflection. So I didn't just use that word randomly. I'd like to connect this a little bit with what we mean when we talk about existentialism. So existentialism proposes, okay, and I'm going to kind of summarize this. We could spend a whole session just on that philosophy and literary approach and how that emerged, but right now I just want to kind of give you the bare bones. It proposes, first of all, that human existence cannot be understood exclusively through the lens of natural or social science. So if you take the field of biology, whether it's evolutionary biology or molecular biology, how people are formed from their very tiniest parts. If you take the fields of psychology, behavioral psychology, any kind of psychology, neither of those is sufficient. Existentialism proposes. Neither of those is sufficient for us to really understand humanity and what the human experience is. In addition, moral norms, if we think about humanity and human beings in terms of responsibility or intention, what my intention is, where blame is to lie for actions, and virtue, even virtue, those two are insufficient in explaining what it means to be human. Existentialism proposes that Notions of authenticity, this is where Natan is going to come in. Personal choice and personal experience within the context of an indifferent or meaningless universe. That is often part of what existentialism is about. It certainly will be the case in some of these poems. Those are critical to understanding human existence writ large. If we understand the authentic human experience, and if we understand that the way that human beings experience life, and the way that people make choices are really just are within our own personal nature, and the world around us doesn't really give us guidance, and it doesn't really react to us. We are sort of alone. We are independent, and that is very important within existentialism. But it's like Natan Zach, there's no ideology underpinning anything. There's no kind of weird world reacting to the person and the person reacting to the world. So what you'll see in common themes of existential literature include boredom, isolation, we'll see some of that soon, alienation, and dread. And here I have for you, excuse me, two interesting, an interesting line. This is one thing that Natan Zach himself wrote in his reflections on poetry. I'll read it in English. The poet does not have any connection with the divine or with heavenly forces. He barely has any connection with himself. So it can be a little bit sad, it can be a little bit depressing, but I think it also has a certain authenticity to it, and we'll start to explore that right now. Actually, I'm not going to go back there yet. We haven't gotten there yet. So let's look at the poems together. We'll look at some of these, if not all of them, see how far we can get. So the first poem that I have on the upper right here is a poem called Anak. Right? In the world, the word Anak means giant. So I'm going to read it out loud very briefly, and then we'll talk a little bit about it together. So here's the poem. Ani Anak, ve'rak ani Anak. Kasher ani merim et roshi, כוכבים נוגעים בראשי. כאשר אינני מרים, איש איננו משים אל ליבו שאינני מרים. Okay, so again, I'm assuming that there is a baseline understanding of Hebrew in these discussions. What are the positive tones? What aspect of the tone or emotions that's conveyed in this poem would you perceive as positive?
Potential.
Okay, but maybe let's refer specifically to the text right now.
We can touch the stars.
Okay, good, very good. So the phrase, actually, which line were you referring to there? Kochavim nogim beroshi. Okay. So the phrase kochavim nogim beroshi is sort of like a variation on the phrase lagat v'kochavim. So the word lagat v'kochavim, the phrase lagat v'kochavim in Hebrew, really means what it refers to is not just literally touching the stars, but it really describes the emotion, the very positive emotion that's associated with starting to achieve something difficult. You're sort of aiming for something difficult, and you're starting to see success. That's lagat v'kochavim. That's touching the stars. So certainly that would be a positive aspect of the emotion here. And you said also kasher ani merim et roshi, right? Sort of lifting your head up. We'll get back to that phrase in a moment, but certainly that sort of uplift has that potential to be positive. Anything else that you see as positive in this? Okay, good. Thank you. Very good. Okay, ani anak, right? I am big, right? I'm gadol, but literally and metaphorically. Good. What would you associate as the negative lines or tone, emotion here? Again, with reference to the text. Yes.
When he says kasher ineni mirim ish enenu misim alibo she'enenu. Nobody even notices.
No one notices me. If I don't lift my head up, I'm isolated. I could be there and no one would be right next to you, and you won't even know who I am. You won't even notice me. This is certainly a very kind of sad reflection on something. But let's understand the poem a little bit more so we understand where that isolation comes from. Let me add one more piece to this, which is that the phrase merim rosh, merim et roshi, so again, I think we can understand it literally, but also in terms of what it means idiomatically. Leharim rosh is to lift your head, but leharim rosh, idiomatically, is to be arrogant, is to be boastful, okay? So there are a number of things that we can see in this poem. So if we interpret it as in its literal form, which we certainly can do, the poem certainly belongs to us at this point. So what he is saying is along the lines of what you just said. Like, if I bother to lift up my head, if I kind of do something to make myself visible, so I can touch the stars, or the stars can touch me, right? Or I can start to achieve something wonderful. But if I don't, there's equal potential for me to be completely ignored, right? If I don't lift my head up, which could be most of the time in life, right? If I'm sort of just who I am, then I'm alone. I'm completely alienated. Another way of looking at it is, if we say that it's to be boastful, so then what he's really asking us to consider is, does it require kind of selling myself, pumping myself up, right, being arrogant, for someone even to pay attention to me? Not just do I need to be noticeable baseline, but do I really, it seems to be saying, if we take that phrase idiomatically, I need to put myself out there for anyone to notice me at all. I need not just to say, okay, here I am, but, and here's what's great about me, and I'm the best, otherwise none of you will even begin to get it. And I will be virtually, if not literally, ignored. So we start sort of our exploration of these poems with a poem that, regardless of whether you interpret the phrases literally or idiomatically, really represents the potential for isolation, for alienation, even within a group of people. Right? The idea isn't that the idea is not that I'm literally apart from everybody, but that there's nothing to notice about me under many circumstances. Now, I'd like to actually contrast this a little bit with the one right across from it, איך זה שכוכב. איך זה שכוכב אחד לבד מעז? איך הוא מעז למען השם? כוכב אחד לבד. אני לא הייתי מעז, ואני בעצם לא לבד. Yeah, absolutely. If any of these words, if you don't know what individual words mean, I'm perfectly happy to translate. So this is a very, very important word to this poem. Leha'iz means to dare. Right? Now, in fact, let me just read that again briefly, so if you didn't know what that meant, now you'll be able to absorb it a little more. So, איך זה שכוכב אחד לבד מעז? איך הוא מעז למען השם? כוכב אחד לבד. אני לא הייתי מעז, ואני בעצם לא לבד. So let me ask you first, what is this kochav, this star? What's this star daring to do in this poem? He doesn't say it explicitly, but let's try to understand it. Okay, on a simple level, but also very important level, what does a star do? A star shines, right? So how does the kochav dare to shine? Anything else that you can get out of this? That the poet is implying that the star, I'm sorry, that happens because of this.
Because there are so many stars out there, how does each individual star have the nerve to shine?
Right, exactly. There are so many. You wouldn't think, says the persona here. You wouldn't think that the kochav, the star, would have it within him, right? Have an individual star within him to shine. And he says, and the words that are repeated in this poem, it's a short poem, but the repetition here is very significant. Not only is the word me'ez, to dare, repeated, but in addition, the concept of aloneness, kochav echad, levad, levad, right? Sort of emphasizing aloneness. Now, in the poem Anak, what we have is someone who is feeling alone, right? Even though he's surrounded by people. I am alone, I am alienated, I'm not recognized. In איך זה שכוכב, what does he say about himself relative to awareness? What does the persona say here? אני לא לבד. I'm not alone, right? I'm not alone. He's saying I'm surrounded by people. I have whatever it is that I have. I have family, I have community, I have associations. I'm not alone. אני לא הייתי מעז. I wouldn't dare. I wouldn't be able to do what that kochav does, and I'm not alone. So but there's still a certain sadness here. So what is the sadness really about? What is the poet, what is the persona here trying to express? It's not complete alone, it's not aloneness. He's saying it straight out, in contrast to enough. I'm not alone. What do I have to do? And what is he wondering about? Any sense of that? Yes.
And then we get swallowed up with the group and not be able to swallow.
Okay, good, very nice, right? I mean, there are many ways of interpreting this, but that certainly is one of them, right? How does a star dare to single himself out? How does a star dare to say, I will shine here and I will shine at this degree of brightness, whether or not I'm surrounded by other stars, right? How does a star open himself up and become visible? I wouldn't dare to do that. So the group here, if we could hope that the sort of contrast to Anak is someone who feels recognized and loved and comforted in the group. But here, what does the group really serve to do? What's the point of the group in the Lolobad? The idea is that right, exactly, right? In other words, the group doesn't provide comfort for me. The group is something that allows me to be swallowed up. I don't have to shine. I couldn't shine even if I wanted to. I don't know if I would say comfort or solace, but really the safety is a safety that allows me not to shine, not to be who I am, potentially not to be who I want to be. Yes.
How many ways do you interpret ba'ani, in particular the vav and ba'ani? Is it but? Is it even though? Is it a kal v'chomer?
Right. So what I would say is that it presents a sort of a contrast. I would interpret it as the simple and. I personally wouldn't interpret it as the but, although but if we understand it in general, I think you could, like semantically and or but could fit in and really present the same message. The way that I've understood it until now, I haven't really thought about the but piece of it as much, is that I wouldn't dare, and keep in mind, I'm actually not alone, right? In other words, the contrast is.
So is that kal v'chomer kind of thinking, that I who am not alone wouldn't dare? How does a star who...
Right, so I think it is kal v'chomer. I think kal v'chomer might work more if the star actually didn't, but yes, in other words, it's sort of a contrast more than a kal v'chomer.
Okay.
I, who am not alone, one would think that I might be able to, to shine because I have the support of the group. But the star, who is alone, right, it is the one, I'm using he because I'm thinking kind of Hebrew, it's the one that's shining. It doesn't even have the support necessarily of a community. There are many stars, but the star isn't alone in the sky. Millions of miles potential between one and the next. Potentially between one and the next. So it sort of presents a contrast, right?
But there's also the ha'ez, as in the Harim Rosh, the arrogance of standing out when you're in fact part of a group.
That would be, I'm not sure that you would say it in that Hebrew grammatical way, but actually that's interesting, like in terms of the shoresh connection.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Yes.
I think there's also something to be said for the fact that when we look at the stars from below, we see many, many stars together, but in reality, they are nowhere near each other.
Right.
So they are actually levad,
right.
like in real life.
Right. That's very nice. Good. Thank you for adding that. Yes. This was cool.
Could he also be suggesting something about self-reliance, that the only way to shine would be depending on himself and not those around him?
In other words, if I were alone, maybe I would be able to kind of pick myself up by my bootstraps and shine, do whatever it is that makes me be the person I can be.
Or in order to get out of the group, or to get, not to be influenced by the group,
yes.
you need to remain yourself.
Good. Okay, that's very nice. Good. There's a lot, I think, that we can learn about his approach, really just from a very, very short poem here, and taken together with Anak, you really see a lot of perceptions about individuality, what the individual feels, has the potential to feel within the group, and also, I think instances, and we'll see more of these, in which assumptions that we might make about social dynamics get turned on their heads, or assumptions that we might make about what it means to be alone, what it means to be part of a group, get questioned, almost from the start. Okay, any more questions about these two? So the next poem that I'd like to look at with you is right beneath Anak. And it's the poem titled Lo Tov Heyot Ha'adam Levado. Okay, so for this poem we're going to be talking about it a little bit and then look at some of the sources, textual sources for some of the lines that he has here. So I'll read again. And please do ask me if there are words that are not clear. לא טוב היות האדם לבדו, אבל הוא לבדו בין כה וכה, והוא מחכה והוא לבדו, והוא מתמהמה והוא לבדו, והוא לבדו יודע שגם אם יתמהמה, בו יבוא. Okay, so I'll just translate mitmama, or some people say mitmamea means to linger, to tarry. Are there any other words that I can translate for you? So, right now, let's start not with the text. So let's flip the order here. Without looking at the text, maybe you can just tell me what you think the persona's major point here is. Kind of give me a theme or a point rather than text. Change the order. Yeah.
If it's not good for a person to be alone, but that's a person's natural state.
Good. Very nice, right? We take it as a given. It's not good for people to be alone, but no matter what happens, the bottom line is we're all alone. Each of us is alone. Okay? And this actually is it relates to one of the themes you'll find often in Natan's poetry, which is, I think you won't be surprised at this point in time, it's all is for naught, or as some would say, as it's written about in Hebrew, hakol azazel. All is for naught. We try and we try, sort of hevel havalim. Let's look a little bit at the Tanakh sources here, because I think they'll be informative. Tanzach uses Tanakh a lot in his poetry, but what he does is, I don't think that I would go so far as to call it heretical, because his point, again, is not ideological. It's not to turn religious or religious assumptions or traditional.
He's not Dati.
He's not Dati. He's not Dati, no. But he's also not, in his poetry, certainly, I would say, anti-Dati, right? Because, again, he is not ideological in any way. So he uses Tanakh sources as really any good writer of Hebrew literature will, because that is our classical, those are our classical texts. But he divorces them completely from the Tanakh story. Now, we may be able to find some irony in the way he uses them, but his point is sort of just to take classic phrases and to use them in ways that service him. Okay? So, of course, Lo Tov Heyot Ha'adam Levado comes directly from the sort of second story in Bereshit about the creation of Adam and Chava. ויאמר השם אלוקים לא טוב היות האדם לבדו, אעשה לו עזר כנגדו. So God says, it's not good for Adam to be alone. I will make him what's usually interpreted as a helpmate. So he starts from this point, right? Man should not be alone. אבל הוא לבדו בין כה וכה. But he is alone regardless. The part that I think is, in some ways, even it certainly is more complex and a little, more interesting in that way, is this phrase "V'im yitma'ama u'mitma'ameh v'hu levado v'hu levado yodea she'im yitma'ama bo yavo." So, reverse order. I'm guessing that if you're familiar at all with the phrase "Afal pi she'im yitma'ama bo yavo," it comes from Rambam's Ikarei Ha'emunah, the song that we sang, or the phrase that we read repeatedly, right? אני מאמין באמונה שלמה בביאת המשיח, ואף על פי שיתמהמה, עם כל זה, אחכה לו. I actually wrote this by mistake. I meant to erase it because I didn't realize that Bechol Yom She'yavo is actually not part of the original writing of it. I just started writing it instinctively, and then I looked it up and it wasn't there anymore. So we added in the song version adds it in, or later version adds it in. So for Rambam, Rambam takes this concept of tarrying and waiting for something regardless of how long it tarries, and relates it to Mashiach, to the coming of Mashiach, right? I believe fully in the coming of Mashiach, and even though he may tarry, I will wait for him. I still wait. And for Rambam, this idea is not just a principle of faith. He even says that if you don't believe in it, you're kofer ba'ikar. It's one of the areas we must, it's a requirement to believe in Mashiach, regardless of for how long Mashiach tarries. what I found as I was looking at this, as I was researching this, is that the original idea of this comes from not medieval Sfarad, but rather from Habakkuk, from Sefer Habakkuk. Anyone here ever learned Sefer Habakkuk? So it doesn't surprise me actually that in a room with this number of people, only one person would have, because I went to a number of people in our Tanakh faculty, whom I consider among the most knowledgeable people I've ever met in Tanakh, and I found one so far who's learned Habakkuk. It's 3 chapters long, and it's esoteric in multiple ways, both in terms of the question of who Habakkuk actually was, and in terms and the language. What Habakkuk says, what Hashem says, to Habakkuk in Perek Bet is, Ki od chazon lamoed v'yafeach laketz v'lo yechazel, im yitma'ama chake lo, ki bo yavo lo ya'acher. In this pasuk, what's being waited for, what Hashem is telling Habakkuk to prophesy that will be waited for, is the end. Now, the way that at least 3 of the Rishonim interpret the end is the end of Bavel. That Bavel, who is, torturing in various ways Israel, is going to come to an end. Habakkuk is interesting. I want to mention this. Habakkuk, this Sefer Habakkuk, and the prophet Habakkuk is interesting in part in that he is this I do know, one of if not the only Navi, really to present deep theological questions to God that relate to God's omnipotence. The question of how can there be evil in this world if you are all-powerful? So it's in response to these questions that Habakkuk asks God in Perek Aleph that God begins to answer him and says, wait for it. Wait for it, it will come, right? The end of Bavel will come. Rambam takes this and says, Mashiach, wait for it, it's going to come, and we must believe that. And Natan takes this concept, and what do you think these last 2 lines mean here? This, I think, is a bit, right? This, I think, is a bit mysterious. So the first time he says, right? He waits and he's alone, and he tarries, right? He's sort of, no matter what he does, any kind of movement, whether he's standing alone, whether he goes somewhere on the derech, he's alone. What do you think the last 3 lines here mean? Let's try to do this a little bit together. He alone knows that even if he waits, if he tarries, if he lingers, either he or it will come.
The end will just...
Okay, good. So,
how do we know it's the end?
No, so I think...
What is he waiting for?
Right, so that he does not answer this, and then, nor does he ever interpret it, offer us any interpretation of it in his writings. So he really leaves us to interpret this. And I actually debated about whether to share this with you, because I don't have a conclusive, not that I think I need to necessarily, but don't have a conclusive approach to this. That certainly is one of them, right? That especially if we look at the original source of the line, right? That it comes from the end of something. Here in the original source, Hashem is saying to Habakkuk, don't worry, essentially, it will come. But the way that you're interpreting it essentially is much more negative and aligned with Natan Zach, right? That if the end, regardless, whether the end happens tomorrow or whether it happens a year from now, it will happen. The end will come. And I think the original source is what helps us maybe think about end, right? Even though it is clear that he is not clear about it here. Anyone, and that's really the one that comes to my mind, but I'd be very curious if anyone else has any approach, since, again, it's ours. Yes?
I'm just going to quote from favorite author, Anne Patchett. Anybody read her? Because I happen to be reading now, and she writes a book about writing, like a lot of different stories about writing. And she says that readers are always trying to figure out, what does the author mean, what does the author mean? She says, once that book is done, it's not mine anymore. It's not the author's anymore. It's yours. So anyway, stop trying to figure out so much. I mean, there are clearly reasons for writing what she does, but it's also for us to do what we want with.
Right.
So
no, and
I think this is a good example of
right.
that.
No, I think that's true. I think he's doing that, but it's interesting that he likes to convey human experience experience, and he believes that it's his job, but he does it in sometimes esoteric or really opaque ways, right? And there's not always that he's not always going to be straightforward or simple in the way that he describes human experience. And so it does leave a lot to our interpretation, and I think he would completely agree with you that it's not just what the poet writes that is authentic, but what we bring to the reading of it that's authentic.
Yeah, I'm confused about the pronouns in the last 2 lines.
Okay, good.
And it seems to change from what those pronouns would have meant.
Okay, good. So which ones are you referring to, just so we can be clear about that?
Well, Humit Mameh looks at the subject of the poem.
Yes.
And then Gam Imit Mama,
Good.
the subject of the poem.
Right. Good, exactly. So
And Huevo is what?
that's exactly, when I say good exactly, I mean that is the question. And Hebrew allows you to do that. It does allow, the way that he's writing this allows you to leave that entirely unclear. So the way that Mrs. Nevetsky just interpreted it, where the imit ma'ama really refers to it, a case, the end. Right? So in gam imit ma'ama bo yavo. That if the end, even if the end lingers, it's going to get here. The question is, one question is, can we keep the subject consistent and that make it still be about the persona? That's where I don't know exactly what the interpretation would be. Something for consideration. If
So if we change the subject, then how does it relate to the line before that?
oh, I'm sorry. So the who would still be the subject. He, man, he Adam.
Yeah, that's...
He's the only, he alone knows that even if it, the end, tarries, it will come. It will get here.
The end will be.
Right, exactly.
So
So it really,
could you make that God, the last sentence?
good. So I was thinking about that, and I think you could. I think you could. It would be inconsistent with much of Natan Zach's poetry, except the last poem I'm going to show you today. That's what gives me sort of the possibility, that offers the possibility that it could be about God. He doesn't write about God much at all, but the last poem we're going to look at, if not directly, certainly indirectly, implies God and God's presence in the universe, and you'll see how.
So what does that last line have to do with loneliness? He's talking about loneliness, then he's talking about
So what would be the connection between loneliness and the end? That's a good question.
He asserts we're alone.
Right,
So now let's see, switching gears.
possibly. What do you want to say?
You're there to face it alone.
Good. Okay, good. So that's certainly one interpretation, right? That there's association between alienation and death. And death, by the way, if we come back to existentialism, death is also an important theme. Often in an absurd context, but death is an important theme, along with alienation and isolation, boredom and death. They all kind of come together in a depressing, but again, as per, through the lens of some of the poets and philosophers and writers that we read, in a very real way. So for Natan Zach, or for someone who writes within that perspective, it wouldn't be such a leap. That aloneness would be either itself a form of death, that aloneness that might lead to boredom might itself be a form of death, or that the natural step from experiencing aloneness would be to experience death itself.
And would he not be also equating that with nothingness?
Right, I think so, sure. That certainly is a part of it also, especially in a world that's hostile, since that's the assumption here. I'm going to skip the next poem for now, so that I can address the one on the next page, and kind of leave you with an interesting last one. So what I'd like to do is actually play. There are a few Natan Zach poems that have been put to music, very, very famously. I actually knew the songs before I'd ever learned Natan Zach, the poetry. And this is the poem Kiha et Hasadeh. Let me just tell you very quickly what this makor is, what the source is. It comes from in Devarim, in various psukim about what happens when you're in battle and you encounter the enemy, or when you lay siege to a city, what the various rules and hukim are associated with that. So, so if you besiege a city for many days and you capture it, you should not destroy its trees. You should not take an axe to its trees. כי ממנו תאכל ואותו לא תכרות, כי האדם עץ השדה לבוא מפניך במצור. Because you eat from it, you should not destroy it. And this is a big question for the Parshanim. What this means. Literally what it means is, for man is a tree of the field to come before you in siege. So the two interpretations of it tend to be either it's a question or it's a statement, right? For is a tree man that you should treat it as man when you siege it? Because when you besiege a city, there is potential for killing people. So a tree is not man. You save the tree. Another interpretation really equates tree with man. It says no, isn't it? But rather it is. That the tree is like man, so treat it with care, treat it with caution. Natan Zach in his poem goes with that second interpretation. So he's equating man with a tree, but in a very Natan Zachian way. So if you follow here, I'll just tell you the last stanza becomes the refrain. So you're going to hear the last stanza a few times, and I'm also going to cut this short. I just want you to hear the music that was written to accompany this, because I think, whereas for some reason, we can talk about this in a whole different session, the person who wrote the music to wrote a very kind of upbeat like song. It's like, I don't know if it was supposed to be ironic or what, but here I think the music is very appropriate to the tone of the poem itself. I hope I'm going to be able to get this very quickly. Okay, possible that I won't, in which case I'll... I'm just not sure how quickly this is going to work for me. Okay, it looks like I won't. I'd rather focus on the actual poem in the few minutes I have, so let's minimize this. So I really encourage you, if I don't have time at the end, to look up. It's online. It's on YouTube. Singing it, because it's really interesting, the music that goes along with it. So Kiha Adam etz hasadeh. That line is the beginning of each stanza here, except the last one. And what he does here is he sets up a bunch of contrasts. Well, he says like this. People and trees have a lot of similarities, but the similarities that they have are all within contrasts, within contrasting features. So, in the first stanza, כמו האדם גם העץ צומח, כמו העץ האדם נגדע. So, just as man, trees grow, right? They blossom. Just as a tree, man is cut down. And the end portion, the last three lines of each stanza is ואני לא יודע איפה הייתי ואיפה אהיה כמו עץ השדה. I don't know where I've been, I have no idea where I'm going, just as a tree. That's the last three of each stanza. So if we look at the first three of the next two, כמו העץ הוא שואף למעלה, right? So just as a tree, man aspires upward, כמו האדם הוא נשרף בעץ. Just as man, a tree, gets burned in fire. In the third stanza, כמו העץ הוא צמא למים, just as a tree, man thirsts for water, כמו האדם הוא נשאר צמא. Just as man, a tree remains hungry. His thirst is not thirsty. The thirst is not quenched. And if you look at the last stanza, אהבתי וגם שנאתי, טעמתי מזה ומזה. קברו אותי בחלקה של עפר, ומר לי בפה כמו עץ השדה. I've loved, I've hated, I've tried both of those, right? I've tasted from both. I've been buried in a piece of land, and I have bitterness in my mouth as a tree. And here you see all the things that we've talked about coming together, certainly, right? The isolation, alienation, death itself, right? A sense of, I could go this way, I could go that way. It's a little bit like levado ben kovacho, right? I could go this way, I could go that way. It's sad, it's depressing, but what Natan Zach would say is it's also real. And let's be honest about human experience. Now, because I really want class to start on time in 5 minutes, I would like to take more questions, and also because I don't want to end on this note. I'm going to show you, and this refers to what you were saying before, a totally different Natan Zach poem. Because even though he has, these themes are very prevalent in his poetry, occasionally, as in Hatzayar Mitzayer, the first poem I showed you, there are poems that he has that take you to a totally different place. And I still wouldn't say that this is particularly ideological. Certainly it's not patriotic, but it's positive. And even within it though, there's a little bit of negative. So let's look at this together. אני רוצה תמיד עיניים, כדי לראות את יפי העולם, ולהלל את היופי המופלא הזה שאין בו דופי, ולהלל את מי שעשה אותו יפה, להלל ומלא, כל כך מלא יופי. ואינני רוצה לעולם להיות עיוור לפי העולם כל עוד אני חי. אני אוותר על דברים אחרים, אבל לא אומר די לראות את היופי הזה שבו אני חי, ושבו ידיי מרחות כמו אוניות וחושבות ועושות את חיי באומץ, ולא פחות מכן בסבלנות, סבלנות בלי די. ולא אחדל להלל, כן, להלל לא אחדל, וכשאפול עוד אקום, ולו רק לרגע, שלא יאמרו הוא נפל, אלא הוא קם עוד לרגע להלל בעיניים אחרונות, את שלהלל לא יחדל. A little different, yes. Okay. Right, so there seems to be within Natan Zach the potential for appreciating God's universe, and that's why I said God. This is where I mentioned that he doesn't mention God once here, right? But this olam et mi she'asa oto yafeh, the one that's made it beautiful. At the very least, he's saying that some being did this, right? So it's not a godless view of creation, but whether he thinks it's God or not, separate issue. But certainly there is that sense of praise. The world is full of beauty. Still within it, there is the not if, but when I fall. Still within it, there are going to be dips. They may be pretty steep. When I fall, because that will happen, I will get up. I might just get up for a split second. I'm going to get up though, so they won't say he just plain fell, but rather he got up. He got up just for one more moment to praise, right, with his last eyes. That which should be praised, and also that his praise should never end. So at the end here, you're seeing falling, but at the very end, you're noticing that it probably refers to death, right? Because and also unafal is also a way in Hebrew of saying he died, right? We talk about soldiers in that sense, in other contexts also. So at the end, so death is for certain, whether certainly dips, but death also is going to happen. But he presents that not in a sort of a fatalistic or this is what life is about or even stoic way, but rather I know it's going to end that way. Life itself is going to end that way. But first what I want to do is praise whatever I can in this beautiful world. She'ein bo dofi, that is faultless. Sorry, that is faultless. This is a little bit of a different Natan Zach. We see the themes within it, but he can have obviously sort of a positive outlook on life as well. Okay, I think I have maybe a minute or so I'm happy to take questions and comments. Yes?
Did the French existentialists, Dr. Camus, etc., influence Zach and vice versa?
Right. So I don't know whether Zach had any influence on the French existentialists. I haven't looked at it from that angle. What's interesting about Zach, I can't answer that definitively, but certainly he was a great reader of philosophy and literature in multiple subjects. But I know for sure, I shouldn't say for sure, what is interesting about his background is that he himself, his father was a German Jew, his mother was an Italian Catholic. They met on a trolley in Amsterdam. She knew French. His father never knew French. They communicated mostly with hand signals and with a tiny bit of French. So Natan Zach grew up with multiple languages sort of in his head, certainly Italian and German and Hebrew. A little bit of French, I don't know exactly how much, but obviously he could have written in translation. One would think he would know a lot about existentialism because of his career as a critic and not only as a writer.
But within single works, Camus came back and said he had hope, whereas here in individual works you don't see. You see pessimism, but only here, finally you see kind of a hope.
Right, exactly,
Yeah.
exactly.
But even in the poem before, the metaphor equates, God's universe and man
Yes.
with the good and the bad.
Yeah, no, it's very true. It's very true. He recognizes the good. He recognizes the good, and that's why I wanted to end with this, just to say essentially, and I'll go at this point, to say that his poetry is, I think, and the personas in his poetry are not trying to convey simply depression or the ultimate sadness of the universe, but what he really views as the authenticity of the universe, and that includes goodness, that includes what there is to praise, the faultless universe, and at least according to this, but also the very real plottingness or isolation or alienation that is a hallmark of for many people, of individuals and of humanity. Okay, thank you.